Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to day 3 of our Genomics Forum. We hope you've been enjoying our 3-day program so far. First, before we get started, I would like to acknowledge that I'm presenting from the traditional and unceded territories of the Coast Salish people here in Vancouver. And this includes the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish nations. Today, I'm joined by 3 amazing women in STEM who have found themselves on the front line of debunking COVID myths using social media. Today, we'll be answering questions sent in on our social media platforms by our followers, and hopefully we'll also have a chance to answer some questions that are coming through on Slido from people who are watching now. Clearly, there's a need to debunk misinformation online, as we heard during our second session this morning. Groups like Science Up First here in Canada, which we've signed up to, are working hard to stop the spread, and our 3 panelists have all been featured on their platforms so far. So I would like to introduce, first of all, we have Dr. Williams, who's currently a postdoctoral fellow at Cornell University, working on cell-free production of vaccines against emerging pathogens. We also have Dr. ChristianMarie, who completed her medical school at New York Medical College, then moved to Florida, where she set up her own medical and wellness practice. And we've got Dr. Dainis, who has since completing her PhD in genetics at Stanford 2 years ago, has been working as a freelance science communicator. Can I go to you first, Dr. Williams? Can you give us a quick introduction to yourself and your work?
Thanks, Phoebe. So as Phoebe said, I'm currently a postdoctoral fellow at Cornell University, and I'm working on developing a system for simplifying the manufacturing of vaccines against emerging pathogens in order to increase vaccine access in developing regions and resource-limited parts of the world. My background is in genetic engineering. I'm a chemical engineer by training, and I got involved in sort of the COVID-19 vaccine education work because of initially my friends and family having a lot of questions about the vaccines and just being exposed to tons of misinformation that I wanted to clear up. So I'm really excited to be a part of this panel and answer questions that people may have.
Excellent, thank you so much. And I'll hand over now to Dr. ChristianMarie.
Thank you. Again, my name is Dr. ChristianMarieCollman. I'm a board-certified family medicine physician and the founder and CEO of Pros Medical, a direct concierge practice located in Orlando, Florida. I also enjoy, outside the office, sharing medical and health information, especially around COVID, through social media and then also on print. So thank you again for allowing me to be a part of this panel with all of these amazing women.
And last up, we've got Dr. Dainis.
Yeah, so thank you for having me here. My name is Dr. AlexDainis, and as you mentioned, I received my PhD in genetics a couple years ago, but have run a science education channel on YouTube for the past 8 years and have branched out into other social media. And so was not expecting to be doing quite so much COVID-19 communication over the past year, but once these RNA vaccines started to become the front runner in our sort of vaccination strategy in a lot of different places, I thought that I could add my voice into at least the genetic side of COVID-19 and these vaccines. And so the questions kept coming in, so I kept making content. And so I'm really excited to be able to clear up as much genetic information around these COVID-19 vaccines as possible. So thank you for letting me do that here again today.
Excellent. Well, you're very welcome. So glad to have you all here today. So we've sent our questions sent in by our followers to these wonderful panelists, and we're going to get started with some of the content that we have created to answer some of these common questions. Our first question was, why do I need a vaccine for a disease with a 98% survival rate? This is something we see crop up all the time, and Dr. Williams has created our answer.
COVID-19 was ranked as the 3rd leading cause of death in the US in 2020, surpassed only by heart disease and cancer. Most persons recover from COVID-19, but the estimated 98% survival rate worldwide would still lead to a massive number of deaths if the disease was left to spread unchecked. For example, in the US population of roughly 328 million people, over 6 million people would die. This does not include the many people who survive but develop severe complications requiring hospitalization. Additionally, about a third of COVID-19 patients who are never sick enough to require hospitalization continue to complain months later of symptoms like fatigue, loss of smell or taste, and brain fog or neurological problems, and recent data pointing to the impairment of male fertility. When most of a population is immune to an infectious disease, this provides indirect protection or herd immunity to those who are not immune, reducing the likelihood of transmission. Vaccinated persons put up roadblocks for viral transmission. If a virus has nowhere to live and replicate, it's going to die out.
Fantastic. And I think one thing that's important that you've included there is survival doesn't necessarily mean going back to being perfectly normal. There can be long-lasting side effects, even if you are young and healthy.
Yeah, and even persons who are young and healthy, they are not immune from having, severe forms of the illness or potentially dying from it. So I think that's something people have to keep in mind. You need a vaccine because it provides that very specific protection to protect you against a virus. It's not something that you can just get from taking multivitamins or herbal remedies, etc. When it comes to immunity, the protection required is really specific, and that's something that only a vaccine or prior infection could provide.
Absolutely, and there's no way of knowing ahead of time if you contract it, if you're going to have a really mild case, or if it's going to be really severe. So the best course of action is to be protected.
Yeah.
Okay, our next question was, is one vaccine better than the others, and should I wait for that one? And this is a question that comes up all the time. I'm sure everyone has seen it across social media. Dr. ChristianMarie, would you like to lend your support to this one?
Certainly. This is one of the most popular questions that I have received, and my answer is typically always whichever one you're able to get access to first, right? So I'm going to quickly just go over a brief review of the 3 vaccines that were currently being used right now in the US and tell you why all of these vaccines are pretty excellent. We know right now 3 vaccines that are available and have been FDA, EUA approved were Pfizer, Moderna, and J&J, right? We know Moderna and Pfizer, the initial first 2 vaccines to get EUA approval, and they both require 2 shots. It utilizes the mRNA technology that delivers a temporary message instructing our cells to make that same spike protein that's located on the surface of the SARS-CoV-2 virus. This then triggers our immune system to create antibodies. J&J, however, comes in and uses a different approach. A different approach for our cells to make the spike protein. So instead of utilizing the mRNA technology, J&J's vaccine uses an inactivated virus to deliver the instructions for our cells to create spike protein. This is a one shot and done for right now vaccine, and it can also be stored and refrigerated for up to 3 months, unlike our mRNA vaccines. So when we watch the news and we read lots of papers, we see all of these numbers on efficacy rates, right? We see Pfizer coming in at 95%, Moderna at 94%, J&J averaging 67%. And of course, when we see these numbers, there's some thought that, okay, 95%, 94%, that's got to be better than 67%, right? That has to mean that's a better vaccine, but not necessarily, okay? We really can't truly compare the overall efficacy rates with J&J to the mRNA vaccines because the trials were performed at different points in time. They were performed in different locations. And also J&J's clinical trials were more recent when the variants started emerging as well. Pfizer and Moderna's trials were done earlier before a lot of the variants started to emerge. And so it's really important to keep this in mind when you're thinking, you see the numbers and you're like, oh, which one's the best one to get? The numbers that we truly care about are how well do these vaccines protect against severe disease leading to hospitalizations and death, right? And across the board, all of the vaccines appear to have 100% efficacy at preventing hospitalizations and preventing death, okay? So you just have to keep that in mind. The goals of the vaccines are to keep us out of the hospital, to keep us alive, and to help us reach herd immunity. And this is what they're all doing, okay? So, we're still learning so much about the vaccines. And I think in the upcoming months, as more studies are being done, we may find out that some vaccines are better for certain individuals. There certainly are advantages to all of the vaccines, but since they really haven't been studied head to head against each other, there's no way for us to know which one is like the best vaccine and for whom. So for right now, again, I would say really just try to get the vaccine that is first available, to you, because all of the vaccines really have demonstrated high efficacy, in their respective clinical trials.
And waiting for one specific vaccine is leaving you unnecessarily exposed. If you could be protected with any of the brands, it's a better option than waiting for something specific and potentially getting very sick as a consequence.
That is a great point. Very true. Yes.
Hopefully we can have everyone vaccinated who wants to be vaccinated really shortly, and we can all move on beyond the pandemic. But until then, we've got another question also about the vaccine, very popular, of course. It said, I'm getting my COVID vaccine tomorrow. Does that mean I can go back to normal? I found this one an interesting one, and I'm sure that different public health guidelines exist in different locations. But in order to find the information for this one, being based in Vancouver, I went to the BC CDC, and they have a wealth of information about the best information we have available right now. And I think it's important to remember that the vaccine doesn't work immediately. You can't just go straight out and, meet with 15 friends and have a party. You need to still be mindful, and it's probably better to be safe than sorry with all of these actions. If you can reduce your risk of being exposed, it's probably best to avoid that risk. I think perhaps if we head on to our next question, also about vaccines, question 4 was, is it true the vaccines are only effective for 3 months? This is a common one that's been circulating online. And
have you heard the concern that COVID-19 vaccines only last for 3 months? It's not true, but I've gotten this question a lot, including from people in my own life, so I want to talk about it. I'm pretty sure it started because people were looking at the clinical trial data released a few months ago that said that the vaccines were effective for at least 3 months, not only, but at least, and that got sort of miscommunicated. And that's because we don't have time machines, so we can't go forward into the future to see exactly how long they'll last. We just have to work with the best data that we have right now. And we had good data from enough people that said that it was effective for at least 3 months. But now Pfizer has just released new data that updates that for their vaccine to at least 6 months. Because now we're another 3 months into the future and we can say, hey, it's still working. And it's still 91% effective against symptomatic disease. So again, it's not only 6 months, but at least 6 months. And hopefully, again, 3 months in the future, we'll get to update that number again.
Yeah, so I think one of the important things about this topic is that we're communicating science and we're all learning about the science of COVID-19 and these vaccines as it's happening, which is not something that I think most of us are very familiar with. Typically, we hear about science at the very end of a study after years and years of, work and conferencing and papers and publications. But right now things are moving very quickly. And so we have to sort of separate things into two categories of what we know and what we're still learning. So what we know right now is that these vaccines are effective, and they're effective for at least 3 and then now at least 6 months. But we don't know yet, and we're still learning how long they will be effective for. And that doesn't mean that it stops at 6 months, but it means that while we would, again, love to go in a time machine forward in 2 years to say, okay, it works for at least 2 years, because these vaccines were just starting to be given in 2020, we only have so much data to look at so far. So we know right now we have really good data from a lot of people, both from people who got these vaccines in the clinical trials and now people who are starting to get them in the general public, that they are good for at least 6 months. And we'll keep updating this sort of chunk of information that we are learning about as we go. And I think people are trying to do. And, some of us, but also the researchers who are actually doing this work, are trying to update people as quickly as possible and as soon as possible. But I think that's a good thing to keep in mind, that there's a lot of things that we know they're safe and effective, but we're still learning a lot of other things about these vaccines. So they're good for at least 6 months, and we think much longer, but we want to make sure we're never saying something we don't have data for, and we just don't have that future data yet. But as that data comes out, these trials and the FDA and the CDC and the Canadian organizations as well, and the EMA will keep updating people with whatever that up-to-date number is. So almost there, but
we need a little bit.
We just need more time.
Yeah,
we need more time, or a time machine.
A time machine would be interesting. We had a panel yesterday, and 2 of our scientists were saying also it's important to remember you don't go to sleep one night and with a full immune response and wake up the next morning with none. It tapers off. It's not immediate. So even if it does begin to drop down, even if we do need booster shots, you're not going to lose complete immunity overnight. There's a lot of things that we can do to try and keep people protected. It's not all or nothing.
Yes.
Another question about vaccines is question 5, which came in on Instagram. Why did the mRNA vaccine get approved so much faster than the other vaccines?
Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Asha Williams, a chemical engineer and researcher at Cornell University. There is a lot of misinformation circulating about COVID-19 mRNA vaccines, so I'm going to clear the air on some of these myths. In no particular order, I'll be discussing 12 of the most popular ones I've heard. Not here to debate, I'll just be discussing facts based on currently available data. So let's get into it. Myth number 1, we can't trust COVID-19 vaccines because they were rushed. These vaccines were developed in record time, so there's understandably some concern, but there are several factors that contributed to the speed of development. Let's discuss. Scientists have known about the coronavirus, aka COVID, family of viruses since the 1960s. Yes, viruses come in families. The first human coronavirus was introduced into the population back in 2002. Remember SARS, then MERS? Research was started back then to develop vaccines against coronaviruses. And this knowledge was applied to the current coronavirus for COVID-19 vaccine design. The COVID-19 vaccines produced by Pfizer and Moderna are the first mRNA vaccines to complete all stages of clinical trial and be licensed for use. But the technology has been around for a while, about 3 decades. Human trials of cancer vaccines using this same mRNA technology have been happening since at least 2011. If there was a real problem with the technology, we would have seen it before now. Another factor was the rapid enrollment of vaccine trial participants, over 70,000 persons for Moderna and Pfizer trials combined. This speed of enrollment is somewhat unprecedented, but skyrocketing cases of COVID-19 meant that it only took a few months for the clinical trials to collect enough data to evaluate the safety and efficacy of the vaccines. Lastly, the devastating impact of the pandemic caused many companies, governments, and researchers around the world to work together and invest more than ever before into vaccine research. Speed of development does not mean that safety or ethics around the vaccine were compromised in any way.
I'll just add that there's understandably concern about the speed of development, because I think a lot of people haven't really seen a vaccine being developed before, and it's kind of unfortunate that the first time they're seeing it is during such dire circumstances. But as I mentioned in the video, there are several factors that contributed to that speed of development. And scientists began working on the vaccine in January of 2020, but there was a lot of legwork that was already done years before. Something else that was unique about this vaccine approval process was that instead of the typical sequential steps where the trials are done and then when they're approved, the vaccines are produced, a lot of activities were actually done in parallel. So these vaccines were actually mass produced before the clinical studies were complete to save time. And of course, that's something that's very risky and expensive, but again, a lot of money was put into these trials in order to get these vaccines out as quickly as possible. So that also added to the speed of development.
And also something that I see crop up a lot in these disinformation campaigns is that, no animal testing took place. So we can't possibly know if it's safe because we skipped that step. And in fact, those animal and human trials were run concurrently. So we did have animal trials,
Right.
just given the state of emergency, they were done at the same time. So I think some people
Right.
willfully
Yeah,
misinterpret the data. And another question about the mRNA as well is, will the mRNA vaccine edit my DNA? Another common question.
RNA vaccines are not going to change your DNA. RNA vaccines work by introducing into your cells a small piece of RNA that codes for a protein found on the COVID-19 virus, a spike protein on the outside of it. Your cells then use that RNA to create just the spike protein, and then your body creates an immune response to it. Whole video in more detail on YouTube. And that RNA is turned into protein in the cytoplasm of your cell. It does not need to go into the nucleus where your DNA is. And that RNA will break down over time, so it's not going to just stick around in your cells forever either.
So I think part of the reason why this question crops up a lot is because we don't often think in our day-to-day lives about what DNA and RNA are doing in our bodies every day anyways. So the cells in our bodies are busy places. They need a lot of proteins and different things to function and work. So the typical flow of information is that we have genes in our DNA, which store the instructions that our cells need to function or to build proteins. That DNA is copied onto a piece of RNA. That RNA then leaves the nucleus, goes out into the cell, and gives your cell the instructions to make a protein. So the DNA is like a cookbook up on your shelf. The RNA is like a little recipe card that you can copy a recipe onto, and then you can take that RNA out into the kitchen and then make a protein or the meal that you're going to make. So these RNA vaccines sort of skip in at that middle step, and they give your cells instructions to make just one additional protein, but they don't have to interact with your DNA at all to do that. They're just putting in a little snippet of RNA. It's like you're headed from the bookshelf to the kitchen and somebody hands you a recipe card along the way. You take that with you and you make that protein. And then when you're done making that protein, you get rid of the RNA, you rip up that recipe card. So there's a lot of RNA turnover in your cells already. Your cells are constantly making and then breaking apart RNA. So once your cell is done with that piece of RNA, it's going to break it apart, it's going to go away. And all that's going to be left is that spike protein. Your body's going to make antibodies against that spike protein and remember those. And then eventually that spike protein itself is going to be degraded too. So the RNA is going to come in, do a quick little job, degrade and go away, and it will not interact with your DNA, and it's not going to leave any lasting effects on your genome.
It's such an important point. I saw online someone describe it as like a post-it note. So it's just a temporary set of instructions. It's not permanent. You don't need to worry that it's going to stay around in your cells forever. And I think yes. There's been concerns about, like, if it is, which it isn't, changing our DNA, is there a problem with it's potentially going to make have impacts on our body that are long lasting? And one of our next questions was, is it true the vaccine will make me infertile? I love that so much, Dr. Christian-Marie.
Thank you. Hopefully this helped you, groove or move a little bit. But, I created that TikTok in the earlier, back in November, December, because I was getting a lot of questions from family, friends, patients with these concerns and, these myths that were going around online. And so that was the impetus behind, this video. And in terms of fertility, I will start off by saying that there's no evidence that, any of the vaccines that we have right now against COVID-19 cause infertility. Yet this happens to be a reason that many are reluctant to obtaining the vaccine. This claim really started when some individuals suggested that the vaccine contained a protein that was very similar to a protein that functions in the human placenta. This protein is called syncytin-1, so you may see that around on the internet. And syncytin-1 is vital for the placenta to remain attached to the uterus and to basically act as a source of nutrition and blood supply for the baby during pregnancy. These individuals suggested that if the vaccine causes the body to make antibodies against syncytin-1, then they argued that it might also cause the body to attack and reject the placenta, the human placenta, leading to infertility. So we do know that, on the coronavirus's spike protein and syncytin-1, they do share small stretches of the same genetic code, but it's not enough to make them a match. I like to use the analogy that it would be like two people who have phone numbers that both contain the number 5, but you wouldn't dial one number to necessarily reach the other person, even though the phone numbers share a certain digit. And so there's some similarity, but it's on a very, very, very tiny level. And I think it's also helpful to know that during some of the vaccine studies, there were some participants who became pregnant during the vaccine trials. We've seen it in Pfizer trials. We've seen it in J&J trials as well too. So I think that should also provide a little bit of reassurance for individuals who are concerned about the fertility aspect. We have information from ACOG, which is the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, that recommend and encourage women who are eligible and they're contemplating pregnancy to proceed with getting the vaccine. So truly, the bottom line is that there's no evidence to support the claims that vaccines cause infertility.
I don't think we can say that enough. And if there's anyone who's based in Canada and wanting some confirmation, the Society of Obstetricians and Gynecologists of Canada have clearly stated that this is untrue and it is safe. It's not going to impact your fertility in the future. So hopefully that can allay some people's fears about whether or not this is going to have long-lasting impacts with the fertility. But our next question was in the same sort of field. Is it safe to get the vaccine during pregnancy?
I was busy thinking about
So the tweet that I shared in that video was essentially from a doctor who was talking about the fact that most of the young patients on her ward for COVID-19 were pregnant women, and they're having really severe, experiencing really severe forms of the illness. So yes, pregnant people may choose to be vaccinated. All of the currently authorized COVID-19 vaccines are non-replicating vaccines, which means they're able to create an immune response without replicating inside of the host cell. So based on how these vaccines work in the body, we believe that there's no risk to people who are pregnant. And although there wasn't a specific trial done just on pregnant women, a preliminary analysis of COVID-19 vaccine safety data didn't find any evidence of safety concerns in a group of over, I think it was 35,000 pregnant women who received either Pfizer or Moderna. And they were either pregnant or became pregnant shortly after getting their mRNA vaccine. There was also recently in March a smaller study that found that those vaccines are not only safe and effective during pregnancy, but they also found that antibodies were present in the umbilical cord and breast milk, suggesting that babies can also be partially protected from COVID-19 when a mother gets vaccinated. So if you're pregnant, do talk to your practitioner if you have concerns about whether you should receive the vaccine, as ultimately it is your choice. But do keep in mind that pregnant people are at an increased risk for severe illness or death from COVID-19, as well as increased risk of adverse pregnancy outcomes like preterm birth. I know in Brazil, they are currently facing a disaster of maternal deaths, and it's so alarming that authorities are actually now urging women to delay having children until the country kind of can get the outbreak under control. So it really is a serious issue when it comes to pregnant women.
Absolutely. And it's also worth remembering that there are other vaccines that are routinely given during pregnancy. So perhaps the flu vaccine or the tetanus shot, these are vaccines that have been given during pregnancy for decades, and we would know if there were problems. So I think that's a really good point, that it's important to protect this very high risk population of pregnant people, and they're a priority group for vaccines here in BC. And if you want any more information, there's lots on the BC CDC, lots of resources saying that there is no known serious risk, and it's definitely worth getting vaccinated if you can during pregnancy. And we've got 2 questions left that have come in advance, but don't forget to add your questions into Slido if you want us to address those at the end of our session. But question 9 was, my friend felt pretty sick after getting their 2nd dose of the vaccine. Do I really need to get it? And this is something we're getting asked a lot. It seems like this is becoming an increasing problem around the world. People who are eligible for their second dose and choosing not to. Sometimes it's out of their hands. Perhaps they can't get access to a second dose, but it sounds like a lot of people are making the decision that, well, my friend had flu-like symptoms for 2 days. I don't want to go through that. So I'm just going to skip it and hope that I'm fine. And it sounds like there's, the potential risks of catching severe COVID severely outweigh any potential like mild flu symptoms. Is this something that you're all seeing on social media as well? It's increasingly popular.
Yeah, yeah, I've been seeing that as well. Yeah.
I think, it's good. I mean, I certainly, I got the J&J shot and then shared that like, oh, I felt terrible for about a day or so. And I think part of that is important to let people know so that they're not concerned when it happens. But again, I hope that people aren't scared off by just those symptoms, because it isn't fun. Maybe you won't feel good for a couple of days, although some people experience no side effects at all. But, if it's available, it is so much better to feel a little sick and tired for a couple of days. And I know I watched a lot of movies during that day and drank a lot of tea, and to take that day, because the long-term effects are so much worse if you actually get COVID.
Absolutely. And our last question that we got in advance was, given the virus is mutating, is there a risk that this will mutate to the point that it's a seasonal virus like the flu? And Dr. Dainis, you're going to take the lead on that one.
Yeah, so again, we don't know yet. This is one of the things we're still keeping an eye on. But what we do know right now is that COVID is mutating. And so we're seeing all these new variants. And this isn't especially surprising. We know that a number of different viruses mutate in this way as they move through a population and as they replicate. And so they can pick up small mutations in their genome that may have no effect on the virus at all, or could have the effect of making the virus potentially more infectious, potentially more symptomatic or deadly, or potentially more able to evade vaccines. Now, it is unlikely that any one mutation is going to do all of those things. And again, each mutation could have no effect, small effect, or large effect. But because we are seeing that it is mutating, it is in fact possible that at some point we are going to see variants that are evading these vaccines. So we might need a slightly updated booster vaccine, a slightly updated shot, similar to how we need an updated flu shot every couple of years. The mutations in the two viruses are slightly different, but flu changes. We have different strains through the different years, so we need an updated shot to keep up with that. And it is possible that if there are enough mutations that accumulate in COVID-19, we may need similar booster shots going forward. But actually, very excitingly, Moderna yesterday just announced results from a very small preliminary trial of a booster that they're working on against, I believe, the B117 variant that they gave to a small number of people. It's still very preliminary data, but they showed that this booster vaccine, which had a slightly different version of the spike protein to match that variant, was in fact conferring protection against that variant to those participants in the trial. So it is very possible that we're going to have updated shots moving forwards. But again, we don't know yet, but we're preparing for that just in case. So if it does happen, it may become something where you get your flu shot every year and you get your COVID shot every year.
So we can be prepared.
We don't know.
If this does happen, it's something that we can deal with.
Yes, absolutely.
Excellent. Well, thank you all for answering our questions that we had in advance. Before we cross over to our Slido questions, I wanted to ask you each, what's the one piece of misinformation that you see that you wish you could just debunk forever, rather than answering it again and again in different ways?
I'll go first. That for me, it's the question of whether or not these vaccines are going to change our DNA, because we have studied RNA for decades now. We're very confident on how RNA works, and there's been so much work put into these vaccines truly over many years. As was said previously, these vaccines didn't just pop up over the course of 1 year. There were decades of research that went into making them. we are very confident that this RNA is not going to change your DNA. And yet I have people try to explain to me every day a new way in which it will. And I have to go through and debunk again that it's not going to do that. So that is the one that I wish I could just put to rest.
One day. And
Yeah.
Dr. Christa-Marie, what about you?
I would say I have two. One, that the vaccines contain some sort of tracking device or microchips. And the second one, for those who still feel and believe that, COVID is fake, that it's not real. I certainly wish we could just close the books on those two and not address it again, because COVID is very real. We know the numbers for people who've unfortunately died. We know the numbers for people who have survived, but just because they survived doesn't mean that they will always go back to normal, right? So we do know those things, but those are the two I wish I could just change.
That, and it's just the flu.
That one as well, yes. It's not just the flu.
Not just the flu, it's much worse. And Dr. Williams, how about you?
One that Alex already mentioned, but the changing of your DNA, I've answered that so many different times to so many different people. And also the impression that the vaccine can somehow affect your fertility. Just because I would never take something that would affect my fertility or advise anyone else to do that. So it's just kind of ridiculous that so many people really do believe that and are afraid to get vaccinated for that reason.
It's so unfortunate that there's these disinformation campaigns that really speak to people's deep fears and their deep worries, and they want to protect themselves, but giving them the wrong information that's actually putting people more at risk than if they just listened to the science that was coming out. So we've got a lot of questions coming in on Slido, which is great. First question is, there are talks of mix and match vaccines. Are there any concerns about this? So perhaps getting first dose of one and second dose of a different one. Does anyone want to take the lead on that one?
So I can jump in. For the 2-dose vaccines, your first dose is sort of just priming your immune system, introducing the spike protein pathogen to your system for the very first time. And then that second dose is a booster shot. So your body has already seen the spike protein, but it's sort of coming back again, and that's why you get a more robust response the second time around. I think when it comes to mixing and matching, the only slight concern would probably be the dosages, which would probably differ from brand to brand. But regardless of which version of the vaccine you get, they're all serving the same purpose of providing that boost that your immune system needs in order to fortify the immune response that you already have. So the first shot, you have a small army of immune cells. The second shot gives you a much bigger army. And it doesn't matter where that, like which company produced the second shot, because they're all essentially delivering the spike protein to your system.
But until we hear otherwise, it's probably best to stick with the guideline to get both doses of the same vaccine if you do need to get 2 doses. Did anyone else want to jump in on that question, or shall I read out the next one?
There is an interesting trial happening in Europe looking at mixing and matching the AstraZeneca vaccine and I believe the Pfizer vaccine. So mixing one of these RNA vaccines with a viral vector vaccine. And so seeing if potentially that could infer even greater immune response. So the data is not in on that yet, but similar to looking forwards at boosters, there are trials who are testing these things now. So yeah, definitely agreed at the moment. If you can stick in brand, that's definitely the recommendation and what you should do. But there are people looking into whether or not it's possible that mixing and matching may even be better and may even have some benefits in some cases. So more interesting data coming soon.
Sit tight, yeah. Our next question also about vaccine. What are the effects of the vector and mRNA vaccines on the innate immune system, and how long does it last? Someone has to be brave and jump in.
I can at least jump in a little bit on the RNA vaccine part of this. So one of the, to me, most interesting things about these RNA vaccines is that your body is already really good at recognizing foreign RNA and realizing, hey, that shouldn't be here. And so your innate immune response looks for signals of things that shouldn't be there. It's not as specific as your adaptive immune response, which can say like, okay, that is this specific virus, but your innate immune response is pretty good at saying like, hey, that's a bacteria, that's a virus, that's a piece of RNA that shouldn't be here. I should do something about that. So part of these RNA vaccines and why they're really cool is that they seem to have what's sometimes referred to as like a self-adjuvanting activity. So adjuvants are molecules that are sometimes added to vaccines to increase their efficacy because they stimulate the innate immune response. And there are no adjuvants like that that are added, or none of these traditional adjuvants that are added to the RNA vaccines, because the RNA itself seems to be enough to prompt the innate immune system to say, hey, there's something weird going on here. We should take a look at this. So I am not an immunologist. I cannot tell you exactly how long that lasts, but that is one of the really interesting things about these vaccines. And one of the reasons why I think they have so much promise going forward, because they seem to sort of do this double duty of both delivering the message and sort of revving up your innate immune system to say, hey, we need to cause a response here.
Did anyone else want to jump in on the end of that one? All right. I have a question that I would like to ask, which is changing tack slightly. You've all made lots of videos on social media, and I just can't wrap my head around how you choose which trends to jump on. Do you see a trend you like and try and work out what information to put into that, or do you come up with the information first and you try and find a trend that's going to make it work?
I'll start. It goes both ways. Oh. I'll start. It goes both ways for myself. You know, sometimes I'll just be browsing, you know, online on TikTok or on Instagram, and I may see something, you know, a trend for a different topic, and then I try to figure out how I can do a similar trend, but with health-related information or something specific for COVID. I like to kind of play on the edge as well too. So, you know, in terms of creating the content, sometimes I like to create things that people aren't really expecting to see from a doctor. And because I know it will evoke a response, which is what I wanted to do with my video that you showed earlier. I knew it would create a nice response. You'd get people commenting in the comments. And that also helps to create additional content when you see what they're commenting and their questions are.
Excellent. Dr. Williams.
Yeah, it's similar for me. Sometimes I have an idea already of what information I want to get out there or a trend that I've already seen. And other times I would see a trend and then try to figure out what information I can share using that trend. And I tried to make a lot of not too long videos, but pack information into them. But if I have someone with a specific question, then I would address that in a separate, longer video to provide more detailed information for those who want it.
Excellent. And Dr. Dainis?
I feel like I'm not always the best at hopping on trends. They move so quickly, especially on TikTok. And so as soon as I see one and I'm like, oh, I need some content for that, and then I make the content and then it's the next day and the trend is gone. So I feel like, you know, you got to be ready with things for that. But similar to what Dr. Williams was just saying, you know, sometimes if I see something, I'll try and jump on it and hop on. But if I do see questions coming in, I typically don't make those trendy because they take me a little longer to make, and both that the content is longer, and you know, I want to find sources and I want to research it and that kind of stuff. And at that point, I've missed the trend.
I imagine it's very difficult to keep up with that. So I commend you all on doing such an excellent job. We do have another question coming through from Slido. What are the potential long-term negative impacts of taking an mRNA vaccine versus other conventional vaccines?
So I can start off on this one. You know, just from what we do know right now is that in the way that mRNA vaccines work, there aren't any long-term, you know, potentially any long-term issues that we see right now. Again, everything is still in the works. We're still learning more information about all of the vaccines. We're still doing lots of trials and studies. So things we'll always end up learning something new, right? In a couple of months, something else may appear. But what we do know is that COVID-19 has long-term effects that we are, we still don't even know all of the long-term effects from COVID-19. We know that people typically do not go back to normal, and they can end up with a lot of other complications, long-term respiratory issues, heart issues, kidney issues, neurological issues. However, that hasn't happened with the mRNA vaccines. So if I were a betting woman, I would err on the side of the vaccines as opposed to taking the risk and getting COVID-19.
Yeah, and typically with vaccines, what the things that are called long-term effects are typically things that pop up within about 6 months of getting your second dose. That's why the FDA, they want to look at clinical trial participants for those extended periods before you can apply for full approval, et cetera. So, based on how vaccines work, because they are actually broken down by our system within a couple of days of getting the vaccine, it's not something that lingers in your system or something that you're getting repeatedly over a period of time, like medication, for instance. So it's very unlikely to have long-term effects popping up suddenly 2 years down the road.
And I think it goes back to the point that we are learning as we go. So we know that it's working for at least 3 months. We don't have all the information, but I saw a statistic yesterday that this was accurate on the 12th of March. So it's probably changed a bit since then, but between December and the 12th of March, over 200 million people have been vaccinated with these vaccines. So we know what the common side effects are. We know what the uncommon side effects are, and we know what the super rare ones are. And science and medicine errs on the side of caution. So we would know if these things have been detected. So while we don't know exactly what might happen in 3 years, 5 years time, because we just don't have that data yet, it's all looking promising that we're being safe with the way these medicines are being administered. And I think we've got time for just one last question. And it's, as more variants of the COVID virus are showing up, is it possible that our current detection methods will stop working because it will have changed or evolved so much? Any thoughts?
So I love this question. So there are a couple of different ways that we are detecting this virus in the population. So one of them is using something called qPCR. So this is a method in which we're amplifying small pieces of the viral RNA genome to look for them. Typically when you get the very long swab up your nose, we're looking at a PCR test like that. So we're looking at that genome of the virus that's left behind. Sometimes we're also using antibody tests. So we're looking at your own body's response to that virus. And then other times we can actually do genome sequencing of the virus. So rather than just looking at those little short amplified pieces and getting a yes or no if they're present, we can actually read the whole genome sequence of the virus using genome sequencing. So we have lots of different detection methods. So it would be, first of all, unlikely that the virus would suddenly take a course in which it would evade all three of those and all of the many different types all at once. But it is possible that we may have to update them based on what we see in that detection. So genome sequencing, is going to always be able to read that whole length, but it's possible that maybe, as the spike protein changes a little bit, we may need to tweak our qPCR tests a little bit, or we might want to look for slightly different pieces of that genome. But because we now have such a volume of data on looking on this, it is highly unlikely that it's going to evade all of our detection techniques all at once. And if we do need to update them slightly, the wonderful thing about these detection techniques is that we can change our PCR primers, we can change exactly what we're looking for in genome sequencing. So it's one of the, again, I think sort of very fortuitous and kind of lucky things that this pandemic is happening now versus even 10 or 15 years ago, that we have things like genome sequencing that are cheap enough and easy enough to do at scale, where we can be looking at so many different people in an actually affordable way. So I'm never going to be 100% on anything, but I am highly confident that we will be able to keep tracking it.
Yeah, we had a lot of questions about how the tests actually worked, and we've got content on our social media channels. I'm sure you do as well. And we can certainly share those if people want to have a sort of closer idea of how it actually works and what they're detecting. It's not magic, there's science there, and we can explain it. So we'll make sure that we share those again on our platforms. I hope you all will as well. I think we've run out of time for questions from the audience, but I just want to give you all an option to share final thoughts, or perhaps recommend some places that people can look for reputable information. I know it's a time with lots of questions and a lot of stress, and people are looking for, where should I go? Where can I trust? It'll be interesting to hear your thoughts on where those locations are, and any final thoughts you might have as well.
Well, I will start out just say thank you to everyone who has stuck around and has been listening to, this excellent panel. The past year and a half, ever since things started with the pandemic, it hasn't been an easy year and a half or two for everyone. So if you've made it this far, please pat yourself on the back. You're doing a great job, and please just keep up the hope alive. We're going to get through this together. Please make sure that wherever you decide to get your information from, that you double, triple check your resources. Make sure you understand, who is giving this information, what is their background, if they have, extra education or training in a particular field. You just want to make sure that you are getting accurate information. So that would be all that I have right now.
Great advice. Dr. Williams.
Yeah, so I would kind of echo what Dr. ChristianMarie said in terms of sources of information. I think there are a lot of videos circulating on social media and articles with just really scary headlines. And I would advise people, when you see those things that make you afraid, or, there's something that says, for example, someone died after they got the vaccine. And when you read those articles, somewhere in there it says, there was no direct link between vaccination and cause of death, but the headline is already out there. That's all people see, and that's what they run with. So please, do your research. Don't just believe everything that you see online. And even if you've already had COVID and you think it was mild, you recovered, you're fine, or you think, you're super healthy and you're not at risk, that may or may not be the case. But getting vaccinated is not just about your personal protection. It's also about the safety of your community, your friends and family, and everyone around you. So it's not just a personal health decision, it's an altruistic act for your community. So just keep that in mind as well when you're making your decision about getting vaccinated.
Absolutely. And good point about sensational headlines. Like, take the time to actually read the whole article. Don't just take the headline and run with that. And quick tip is, if something sounds really sensational and you're a bit worried about it, if you type into Google the doctor or the specialist's name and debunked, quite often something will pop up quite quickly if there's someone that's made a reputation for themselves by sharing misinformation. So if you're unsure about someone, just maybe that's a good way of determining who's reliable and who's less reliable. And Dr. Dainis, let's finish up with your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I have to echo what everyone has already said, just asking who is sharing this information, why are they sharing this information, and what are their sources, and demanding sources of everyone, including us. I mean, including people that you trust. You should always be making sure that they are still backing up the information that they're giving. But I think the one other thing that I would encourage people to do is, if you're here and if you're seeking out information and you're doing that and you're asking for good sources, I would encourage you to talk to the people in your own lives about this as well too. We are all on this panel because we really care about sharing this information and getting it out to more people, but there's only so many people we can reach. And, we know that information is most effective when it's coming from someone that you trust. So if it's coming from a friend or a family member or a community leader, that is where we know that people really trust those sources of information. So if you're here and you're gathering good information and you're trying to, share that, I would encourage you to talk with the people in your own lives and share that as well. If there are people who are hesitant or who have questions, that you can also be a force for sharing this good information, because we need everyone to be sharing the positive things versus just those scary headlines, because those do prey on emotions and spread faster. So everyone together can sort of be the guiding force for spreading the good information out there as well.
Absolutely. And I mentioned at the beginning, Science Up First, and a group that's based out of Canada, is a place that you can have a look. They've got social media platforms, they cover all of them. So you can have a look for Science Up First. And Dr. Williams, I know that you're also involved with Team Halo. Do you want to just give us a 10-second spiel about Team Halo?
Sure. So Team Halo, it's a global network of scientists and vaccine experts around the world working with the United Nations to promote COVID-19 vaccines or promote confidence around COVID-19 vaccines, primarily by fighting misinformation about these vaccines on social media platforms. So we're trying to reach that audience that gets their news mainly from these social media platforms versus the mainstream media. So yeah, it's been an interesting journey with Team Halo so far.
Excellent. Well, time to wrap up. Thank you so much to our three wonderful speakers. I really appreciate your time today. Also to our followers who sent in questions on social media, and our behind the scenes tech team who helped us with all of the bits and pieces, and our captioners who've been doing a great job keeping up with us as we speak. I'd like to encourage you to stay around for our closing keynote with journalist Andre Picard. He will be starting his session shortly, so make sure you head back to the event hub, and following his keynote, we'll also have a traditional closing by Elder Lillian Howard, so make sure you stick around for that. But with that, I hope you all have a lovely evening, and thank you so much for joining us today.